January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him. An intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, bearing tail number 76312. This can't be their standard design. No Air Force would build bombers this way. The fuselage gleamed under the tropical sun, its distinct cylindrical shape justifying its nickname among the Allies. Measuring nearly 20 balars from nose to tail, the bomber rested on its tricycle landing gear. Like a massive cigar resting on the runway, the wings, with a wingspan of 25 millimeters from tip to tip, showed no battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder radials producing with 1,500 horsepower each, appeared intact. This was not a crashed aircraft recovered from wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber, abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But what captured McCoy's total attention, what would revolutionize the American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered. When he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels, the fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just a thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 mm thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft throughout the Pacific. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, would expose a design philosophy so foreign to Western military thought that it would take months for analysts to fully grasp its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption that American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, and about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained in this single immaculate specimen of Japan's most important bomber. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, while smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers took off from bases in Formosa. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs on the runways and facilities of Clark Field. Moments later, Zero fighters swept the site at treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were summarily destroyed. Nearly all P-40 Warhawk fighters were reduced to flaming wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from an air raid shelter as the Japanese formation retreated to the north. "What struck me was how they came in," he later wrote in his combat report. "Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters came down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane in the air, but the Betty bombers themselves left untouched." The few American fighters that managed to take off arrived too late, finding only an empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated the exceptional range of their bombers, attacking from bases 460 miles away, a feat that no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's first year of combat would prove to be devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after The attack on Clark Field, 26 G4M bombers joined older G3M Nell bombers in the attack on Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. The Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo attacks executed with a precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilos with a 205-kilon warhead. The Beats torpedoes were designed specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths that could strike ships even in coastal waters. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating precision. The Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, received at least 6 torpedo hits, along with damage from high-altitude bombers. The underwater explosions tore massive holes in the ship's hull. The flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began to list severely. The Repulse, a battlecruiser built during the First World War but modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft fire downed several Japanese planes but could not prevent the coordinated torpedo runs from finding their targets. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within a few hours of the attack. The Prince of Wales sank at approximately 13:20 hours. The Repulse followed at approximately 13:33 hours. 841 British sailors died. The survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from the first contact to the final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves were sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Throughout the Pacific theater, until the beginning of 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in every major engagement. The aircraft seemed to operate with impunity, striking targets at ranges that defied conventional understanding. They struck Darwin, Australia, from bases 1,500 miles away, demonstrating a range that exceeded the capability of any Allied bomber. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across the New Guinea mountain ranges, maintaining pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. They attacked Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance greater than 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across vast oceanic expanses. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces a strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. American fighters based in forward positions lacked the range to intercept Betty bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields suffered attacks from Japanese bases that were themselves beyond the range of Allied attack. The asymmetry in bomber capability meant that Japanese forces could strike at will, while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted during the first 6 months of the war. Betty bombers participated in virtually all Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They hit targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They conducted reconnaissance missions that exceeded the range of any Allied aircraft. The Betty became the symbol of the range and effectiveness of Japanese air power. But the advantage depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could attack without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first half of 1942, when the Allied Air Force remained limited and scattered. But by mid-1942, the tactical landscape began to change. As American fighter strength increased, as Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began to report disturbing losses. The change became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed from Rabaul to attack American positions in Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in what would become the worst individual loss of G4M during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation in every engagement. The Betty exploded in flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned somber nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, 1 Yen Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrible tendency to blossom into fire from battle damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal, commanding VF-17 with F-4U Corsair fighters, the Betty's reputation had transformed completely. The first time we caught a Betty, formation, we couldn't believe the ease with which they went down, Blackburn later reported. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they exploded. We hunted them actively, recognizing them as one of the most vulnerable targets in the Pacific skies. But the true extent of the Betty's vulnerability, the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable, would not be fully understood until American forces began to capture intact specimens for detailed examination. The first significant intelligence breakthrough occurred in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields in Buna, Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying levels of damage. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit of the Southwest Pacific conducted the first detailed analysis. The wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures. Thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, and no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined in Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or field modification. This was the standard Japanese design. The implications were stunning. American bombers in 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator featured them since the XB-24B prototype. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used a layered rubber compound that swelled upon contact with fuel when pierced by bullets or shell fragments, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to the aircraft, but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. However, here was the primary Japanese land-based bomber, produced by the thousands, operating throughout the Pacific theater with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives became equally obvious in the loss statistics that increased with every engagement. The Betty captured at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified as secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized relentlessly for range and speed. Empty weight of 6,741 kg, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight of 9,500 kg. Fuel capacity of 4,180 L, distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the center section of the wings, where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Maximum speed of 428 km/h, or approximately 265 m/h. Maximum range of 6,034 km, exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling of 8,500 mm. Crew of 7 members, including pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 groups of 2, positioned along the longitudinal axis of the wing, where the wing joined the fuselage. This positioning maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any lateral or underside attack would inevitably hit the fuel tanks. The aluminum construction offered no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant that even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating the protection systems exceeded 500 kilos per aircraft. This weight saving translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost in invulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with almost certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers called a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed the loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of the design choices made in September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. Maximum speed of 398 km, cruise altitude of 3,000 km, range of 4,722 km loaded, or 3,700 km, carrying 800 kg of bombs or torpedoes. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. The Japanese Empire extended across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of hitting enemy positions far beyond the reach of carrier-based aircraft. Bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations throughout the theater. Existing Japanese bombers were far from meeting these requirements. The G3M Nell bomber, then in service, had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-17 had even more limited ranges in their early E variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could hit targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's requirements were not arbitrary. They were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future conflict in the Pacific. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From the Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan a strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly, before enemy industrial capacity could generate an overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man in charge of achieving the impossible was Kairo Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team after taking Joji Hattori's place. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European principles of aeronautical engineering and manufacturing techniques before returning to Japan. He immediately understood that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand concessions that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to face the design challenges. The team analyzed every aspect of the bomber's project, calculating weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from various nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials that could offer weight savings. The mathematics was brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed a massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kg. 4,780 L of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kg of fuel weight at full load. To reach the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed a minimum weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced the range or the payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating weighing hundreds of kilograms would be necessary to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight due to the rubber compounds and the additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent reaching the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its entire service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be of unprotected aluminum construction, without self-sealing compounds, without armor around the fuel cells, without fire suppression systems beyond basic extinguishers, and without redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and meeting the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely be catastrophic, but they also knew the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with the available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met all the performance requirements the Navy had specified. The speed exceeded expectations. The range surpassed projections. The payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi building the aircraft at factories in Nagoya. The initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began arriving at operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of land-based Japanese air power during the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, achieving surprise, and operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed attacks from bases the enemy considered safe. Its speed allowed for rapid penetration into target areas. Its payload delivered significant damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, and the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for the crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. From August to October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in what became a continuous bloodbath that the Japanese air forces could not sustain. The August 8th mission alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft, with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations departed from Rabaul, flew 600 miles to Guadalcanal, faced American fighters, and suffered catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more losses. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued attacking American positions in Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics was inexorable. Japanese forces needed to attack American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering a significant strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit the Betty's vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions decreased. In November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with the Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Casualties among the crews approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been made obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners expected losses. All military operations involved casualties, but the scale of the Betty losses exceeded all projections. The unprotected fuel tanks that allowed for a 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any impact on the wings or fuselage would likely be fatal. There was no middle ground, no limping wounded bombers returning home, no damaged but surviving aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 6 3rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed under the wing surfaces where the fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced the maximum speed by 9 km per hour. The maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers, but crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could not prevent fires caused by larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not prevent explosions when tracer ammunition ignited. Fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured real self-sealing fuel tanks, with capacity reduced to 4,590 L to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced the maximum range to 3,640 km, a loss of more than 2,000 km compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by the war's end. The modification came too late and in numbers too limited to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have allowed Betty bombers to operate effectively. The outcome of the war had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began to use the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American cryptographers intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38. Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the Bay. Mission after one aircraft blew a tire on takeoff, and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at treetop height to avoid radar detection, navigate the open ocean without landmarks, and arrive exactly at the calculated interception point at the exactly calculated time. Any navigation error, any deviation in timing, would result in the mission's failure. The interception needed to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft was vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for more than 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was done by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated interception point with a precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 09:34 hours, exactly on schedule, and exactly 1 minute before the calculated interception time, the P-38s sighted Yamamoto's formation. 2. Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to attack the bombers, while other P-38s drew away the Zero fighters. Barber attacked the lead Betty bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits in the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed into the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered. The next day, it was confirmed he had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also went down, killing everyone on board. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated the interception time with 1-minute precision over 400 miles of ocean. American fighters executed the mission perfectly despite extraordinary navigation challenges. And the Betty bombers' vulnerabilities guaranteed that a successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage was catastrophic. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb under its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200 kcal warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket engine and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead's 1,200 kilon of explosives would destroy any vessel it hit, but the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach launch range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30 hours. The 18 G4M bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon under its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying the Oka loads. American radar detected the formation approximately 100 miles away. F-6F Hellcat fighters from the USS Hornet were sent to intercept. The AT Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached the Oka weapons launch range. In the ensuing engagement, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely defenseless while carrying the Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach launch range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching the weapon's launch range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers occurred on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 G4M bombers painted white with green crosses departed from Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft, given the call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2, flew to Ieshima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2 referred to the site where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Densudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The transport variants maintained the Betty's distinct cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo instead of weapons. The crew wore dress uniforms instead of flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, and no military equipment of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. The flight from Murray, Atsugi to Ieshima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range, even in the transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout the flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, ensuring safe passage while preventing any deviation from the planned routes. The White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the opening hours of the war now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the final days of the conflict. The aircraft that had symbolized the range and effectiveness of Japanese air power now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. The Betty's production statistics reflect both the aircraft's importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of its design. Philosophy. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, although some sources cite numbers up to 2,435, including all prototypes and subtypes. The variation in total numbers reflects different methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. The G4M Model 1 comprised approximately 172 aircraft produced from 1941 until early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with a capacity of 4,780 L. The maximum speed reached 428 km/h. The maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-range bomber in service anywhere in the world. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. The G4M Model 2, with greater fuel capacity and slightly higher speed, accounted for approximately 142 examples produced from 1943 to 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,490 L, extending the maximum range even further. The maximum speed increased slightly to 437 km/h. But the Model 2 maintained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. The G4M Model 3, designated Model 34, represented the only variant with real self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by the end of the war, depending on the source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 L to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. The modification arrived too late, and in numbers too limited to affect combat results. The G6M transport variant, converted from bomber airframes, added another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo instead of weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. The G6M Model 1, used for one of the surrender aircraft in August 1945, represented this variant. Production continued until August 1945, with the last aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production declined in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry and resources were diverted to fighter production for home defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, surpassed only by a few fighter types in total production. Throughout 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific Theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets at distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived the end of the war. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that numbered in the hundreds in 1942 were reduced to dozens by an attrition that no amount of production could replace. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were equally devastating, although exact numbers remain difficult to verify from available records. What is certain is that thousands of Japanese crew members died in Betty bombers, their deaths made almost inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. The crews understood these odds and flew anyway, because military discipline and cultural values demanded they accept the risks regardless of the consequences. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their Ibadutinonum assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure luck. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no level of courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masao Kato, who completed 28 combat missions before transferring to training roles, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor protecting the pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The Bombardier's position featured armored glass. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. The pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor reinforcement. The fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from the start of production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems, being about 2,000 kilos heavier than the Betty. Despite similar size and function, the weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced fatalities from thoracic injuries from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing armor against shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties in frontal attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the entire aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected the American doctrine that trained crews represented more valuable assets than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds on most American bombers, but American industrial capacity allowed for this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced more than 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Production capacity meant that American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and strike power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed that achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed that enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every vulnerability of the Betty. In 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. In 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war was written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching their targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the full story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not an oversight, nor a temporary expedient, nor a design failure. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed that range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers created exactly what their specifications demanded: an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimum weight, optimized for the mission requirements they were given. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented reaching the required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and increasing technological advantage. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment above crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that would cost the lives of thousands of Japanese crew members. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident. They were a decision. The Betty bomber served from the first to the last day of the Pacific War. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases. It covered distances that no other bomber could match, but its final legacy is written in loss statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war, carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 763-12 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made combat survival nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so lucky. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers and crossed vast distances of the Pacific, and died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft's design made inevitable. The story of the Betty bomber is, ultimately, about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is bought at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary 6,000-kilometer range meant nothing when the aircraft could not survive the final 100 km to the target. The impressive speed of 428 km per hour provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept from distant bases with warning from radar systems. The 1-ton payload capacity became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. More importantly, the Betty reveals that military technology, divorced from a realistic assessment of combat conditions, produces weapons that kill their own crews as efficiently as they strike enemy targets. The assumptions underlying the Betty's design, assumptions about limited opposition and a short war duration, proved catastrophically wrong just months after the Pacific War began. By the time those assumptions were proven false, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 38. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history to fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in war. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection, even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. It remains as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survival, when range is bought with crew lives, and when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of Betty bombers burning across the Pacific sky marked the consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing the fundamental gap in how different nations approach the war in the Pacific. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to hit targets regardless of the cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided the final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific objectives. Those objectives simply did not include bringing Japanese crews back alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific.